Hello and welcome, everyone out there, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch. Going to be talking about the 13th today, even though it's the 27th. See what I did there? We are excited to be joined by Karen Jeffries, beautiful wife of our VP of Communications, Micah Jeffries.
So glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Karen. As always, anchored by Shamika Piggy, the VP of Operations. I'll be your host this evening, John Connor. So, let's go ahead and get right into business. The 13th. It's an amazing documentary. Had a lot of really amazing statistics in it that I think we'll be able to talk more about. One of the things that I really liked about how the documentary was set up was throughout the first I guess the entire thing was chronological, but it really moved throughout the first half of it. And it gave you 5-year increments of how the prison population was increasing. And I think that was really important to see how the policy changed over time and how that directly related to substantially higher prison populations. It's one of my favorite things from the documentary. Anything off the top of your head, Shamika, before we get into these questions?
Just looking at how the prison population just has boomed over the last 60-some years since what we have called en masse of people being forced into the system with the creation of laws and changes in institutions, how that continues to be something that we struggle with in different realms as well. So I think that we see the word of institution and think one thing, but there's so many of these different systems operating in our communities that have a historic issue from their inception of being inherently racist. And we need to be thinking more about what that means moving forward when we're talking about dismantling or burning down an institution before we start to get into the idea of what it means to move forward with changes. So
yeah, if you guys haven't checked it out already, we have a wonderful presentation by Shamika on institutional racism. We did back in February. Really great presentation. She'll be right back. She's been having a little bit of technical difficulties. Right. No, I think that was really cool. One of the first things that you see in 13th was they mentioned the film
Birth of a Nation.
Yeah. And no matter how many times I hear about this film and discuss all of the different, unpack all of the things that have to do with this film, I'm always surprised. Just how incredibly racist it is. It was responsible for the bringing back the Ku Klux Klan. And something, I don't know, maybe Shamika touched on this in our presentation, but something that stuck out to me in the 13th was that the Ku Klux Klan had not implemented the burning cross until they watched it in Birth of a Nation. That's pretty cool. Let's do that. So
we talk a lot about
we do talk a lot about that.
We sure do.
Yeah,
I really sorry, John. I just think it's really interesting, to compare Birth of a Nation to what we're learning of its applications in reality and how people took it on. Whereas I took a filmography and cinematography class recently, and that was just like step one of the first greatest films that ever came out, and huge hit, huge influence. And then to see that this influence, we were literally watching. I go, oh my God, we talked about that movie. Why? And
Right.
you know, we may be so separated from that filmography and that timeline, but the fact that even a simple movie back then could impact and influence people to mimic what they're seeing, that's pretty powerful.
And I think it's interesting to note it like all levels of society, because I can't remember who the president was, but whoever it was said that the movie was like writing history with lightning. Just like to be that greatly impacted by it at all levels of society was just really crazy to me.
I mean, that also goes toward the responsibility of filmmakers, you know, in the long run. That's a whole nother discussion. But
right.
Do we have questions?
Yeah, we have questions. Shamika, are you going to stick around for a little bit?
I'm going to try.
Well, first up, how did you guys feel after viewing the 13th? Did you feel helpless, inspired, stirred to action, or a combination of all three? Do you think the message of the film was ultimately hopeful? Why or why not?
I don't think that it was overly hopeful, because in the end there was a somber attitude about the entire documentary, in which they are discussing, will these changes even happen? Will prison reform even be a thing? Or will we reform into something more heinous, more sinister, that continues to criminalize people of color or underprivileged communities? So at the end, I didn't feel hopeful about anything that they didn't feel hopeful. They didn't give off this sense of hope to me. They were giving off a sense of approaching with trepidation and intimidation at this grand system. So,
yeah, and to the kind of the how the end of it kind of goes along. There's a great part of it where they're talking about Alec, and they have a representative there from Alec, who is the documentarian did a fantastic job of piecing together all of his comments versus what the panelists were saying. And it was basically where they were saying, you know, we really think that the next wave of the how these, you know, racist law enforcement are going to come about is we're going to be locking people up in their own houses. And it would flash back to this guy who has got an immense hand in policy and lawmaking, saying, you know, I really think we should start locking people up in their houses. And it was just, I don't know if there was a hopeful tone up until that point. I'm a very optimistic person, so I like to think that there's a hopeful tone sometimes when there's not. But that was definitely the nail in the coffin, so to speak, of like, no, it's going to continue, and it's going to take so much to knock it out.
And what I think is really important too, as we look at this and, you know, many of the other social injustices that we're facing, is that, you know, how we're defining what an institution is. We're not saying this one building, this one company. It is how these patterns of behavior have played out, and patterns of legislation have disproportionately marginalized such a group. So I think that's very important to recognize as we begin this larger discussion, is that an institution isn't one place. There's a lot of factors when we talk about the institution of the correctional administration and institutionalized racism.
That reminds me of a lot of the great archived footage they have, specifically of Angela Davis at some of these old rallies, and some of the bigger ideas that she was talking about, even back in the 60s and 70s.
Well, I guess they were discussing with her how the whole government was after her. And to be honest, the Black Panthers were not that powerful, but for them to feel that powerful to the government because of the fear of Black bodies, the fear of Black congregation, of leadership, and how this whole system was trying to come after this one Black woman and her fearlessness through it all. I just thought that was just, I love Angela Davis. I think knowing more about her story made me love her more.
One thing about Angela Davis was I watched it a couple of times, and I wasn't sure if they ever really touched on it. I was not entirely sure. I wasn't really sure why they were after Angela Davis in the first place. like obviously she was saying a lot of things and she was involved in some of these movements, so that's the motive that they had to target her. But I'm not sure why she was in the position to be defending herself in court.
Because they had pretty much made her words like a crime. The things that she was saying, she was like inciting violence. That was kind of like she was increasing riots. Her voice in her, the power in her voice and her words became like a #1 target of like, you know, like if you could go out and incite a crime just by saying certain things. So they were like saying her rally speeching, her ability to convey a message was criminal.
So, like, if you tweet a bunch of racist things and then incite a mob to storm the Capitol, that should be a crime.
That would be considered like a crime.
Sure, if it was Angela Davis. I see. Okay.
Moving
on to the next question. This documentary emphasizes the current crisis of mass incarceration is directly tied to our country's legacy and history of slavery. By showing how slavery shifted to convict leasing, to Jim Crow segregation, to the war on drugs, 13th argues that a system of oppression are durable as they are often reinvent themselves. As Angela Davis stated in the film, historically, when one looks at efforts to create reforms, they inevitably lead to more repression. What are some ways that we can end this cycle? What do you think are some of the factors that allowed the system of racial control to simply evolve and replicate itself for the past 150 years? And how can we be more vigilant against institutional racism?
I think we need to stop letting people who have put in place, institutions of oppression to continue to also be the people who are going to liberate.
Yeah.
And I think that was the biggest thing that kept coming up with Bill Clinton and everyone who was like, oh yeah, we can reform, we've changed, and we're now going to lead this crusade into an institution of reformation for the great and good of all people. Well, should you be the one leading it is the question, because you made heinous mistakes in the past to have created criminalization and increase it tenfold. Should you be the one leading? I think we need to start looking towards the communities that are hurting the most to look for leaders who can reform in those communities, because they don't have a history of causing that pain. And I say this as we have two people in the highest of office in the land who have had strong support of criminal bills in the 90s and in the 80s, and have supported legislation that has imprisoned people. And I say that strongly in the, against Kamala Harris and Joe Biden.
I think one of the most impactful parts of the documentary was, I'm not sure what his name was, but there was a man, he was talking about how when, I think it was during the Clinton administration, he was talking about how when you have taken out generations of Black leadership and, not only people like, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King that have been assassinated, seemingly by their own government, not only do you have that, but then you have these generations of Black leaders who have been jailed simply for being Black leaders, that you have to turn somewhere, and so it makes it hard for, hopefully we're starting to move in a direction where it's not the case anymore, but you have, generations of people who have, they don't have the structure and support to look up to. And so they had to look up to people like Bill Clinton, who, as they addressed in the film, he apologized for some of the things that he put into place, but that doesn't change the fact that he put them into place in the first place. And also there's a lot of skepticism about the apology as it came, during Hillary's presidential run. So there's just a lot there. Well,
do we have any questions in the chat? How are we doing on chat?
I'm watching the chat.
Okay.
So far.
Okay. We're ready for you guys.
Well,
below.
Yeah, if you guys have any questions, you want to add something in the comments, if you want to yell at Shamika for her bad connection, go ahead and put that down below. But kind of what you were talking about a second ago, Shamika, with the people who have put these systems into place don't need to be the ones leading us out of it. It's kind of like a vicious cycle, and it reminds me of kind of the struggle that we as an organization have had thinking about what we need to tackle and what areas we need to look at first. Because we've talked about this, lobbying for voting rights is something that needs to happen. Lobbying for voting rights needs to happen before we start pushing, major legislation, because the people that you're going to have vote for things need to have access to vote, so the things that you want to support can pass. So it's just, I see some similarities there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's move on to this next question. How does the 13th characterize our criminal justice system and political institutions? How did this film shape your understanding of the prison system? Was there a particular case or series of facts that altered or challenged any of your pre-existing views? And explain. And I know that Shamika has a couple of cases that she always keeps in her back pocket, and this documentary talked about a couple of them.
Well, I used to think that, I think as a member of the Black community, we always saw Bill Clinton as this like godlike figure. Definitely 13th really makes you go, why the hell did we vote for him? Like, in the Black community, he's really revered, and he's really one of the most, I guess, poachers of the Black community, just stealing Black bodies off the streets and putting them into work in the prison system. And that's something that most people of color, if you don't know the political system and you don't know the history of politicians, you would never think that about Bill Clinton. BLM definitely brought it out during Hillary's election for president, and calling out Bill Clinton and his practices and how it harmed this entire community. But had you not been a part of those discussions, you would have never known the atrocities that the Clintons helped to bring forth with their idea of super predators and three strikes law and all that support for the 1994 crime bill. You would have never thought that. So that's something I left, even now knowing more about it. But when I first watched it, I was just reminded of how bad Bill Clinton was. So that's what I took away from it. Just like stuff you just would have never thought about.
Yeah. Clinton was the first president that I can remember seeing on TV. And I am very young. But, I had always, growing up as a white boy, we had always thought of Clinton in terms of the economy. We had one of the best economies that we've had under Clinton. And so I didn't know about, all this stuff. I guess it's shame on me for not putting more, thought into things, because, we know about the three strike law and about mandatory minimums and the 85% serving your sentence, these type of laws, and you know about when they came out. So if you think about it long enough, you could put two and two together. But I just never did that, and I think that's one of the biggest things that somebody could take away from the documentary.
I recently saw a cute little tent city, but it was like a little actually built like houses, but they were mini, all in some major city. I was scrolling, I'm sorry, I don't remember where it was. But they were talking about how even for the homeless population, that creating this little pod city was cheaper for the city than for the cost of incarcerating these individuals or pursuing them for any other illegal activity that they may just be literally off their feet and can't get to that recovery point.
Right. Oftentimes when people look for places to cut the budget, they go first to the social welfare programs. They go for, what they see as handouts, things like this. Nobody thinks about, how many people are in jail right now for bullshit offenses that shouldn't be crimes at all. And how much money can we save if these people aren't in jail and we're having to pay to house them, to feed them, to pay people to watch them? It's not just, set aside the fact that it's a major injustice to these people's lives. It's costing our country hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a complete lose-lose situation for everybody except for people like CCA, who were making, billions of dollars off of, black and brown bodies, keeping them off the street and keeping them in their, housing facilities.
And private prisons in general.
That's just the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. The American prison labor system, I think, is the biggest. I don't know if it's a shock, but I think it's a thing that we all walk away from feeling like, damn, that's really happening. It's not in a third world country. It's really right here on American soil that we have imprisoned people primarily just to benefit corporations, and that's the most atrocious thing. It's like you probably wouldn't be spending a prison sentence in here if it weren't for the fact that we have become enmeshed with corporations and businesses to make work happen. And that for me was like, imagine so many people who could be free if it wasn't for these corporations going in and creating ways to incarcerate people for their own benefit or capitalism. It's just really, that's the part that I think I walked away to with. It's disgusting.
Well, and one thing, just one small piggyback, is that, for privilege and those of Caucasian background, there is crimes are just a fine, and that fine is just how much it costs to do it. It's like a ticket price. It's not so much that, you've been slapped on the wrist. It can be perceived as that. And then second of all, the U.S. specifically, I was just reading about this the other day. It's 1 in 4 U.S. persons has been incarcerated. That's ridiculous.
The documentary ended with 1 in 17 young white males can expect to be in jail at some point in their lives, but 1 in 3 black males can expect to be in jail for some time in their lives. Karen, that's a really great point that you brought up about the fine system, specifically for wealthy people. I just wanted to point out too, if you guys know me, I'm a big sports fan. Alden Smith was a former Mizzou player. Right now, he's playing for the Seahawks. He actually turned himself in for charges of second-degree battery. I think he choked a guy in a coffee shop, I think, are the circumstances. But the report that I read was very interesting. He obviously is going to pay the fine, but your choices of jail time or fine were just drastically different, and I wanted to call attention to it. That you could either spend 8 years in jail or pay $2,000. And that's according to an article that I read. And I think that's...
So that's a current case right now.
That just happened last week. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we already know the story of Khalif. They hit on Khalif's story in the documentary. It's not a complete story, but they give some light to it. Yeah, he was in jail because of $900 initially because his mom couldn't fund that bill. He would have been able to leave and go home that day, and they would have been able to, from there, unravel the case and know that there was no evidence against him had his mother had $900.
The saddest part of the Khalif Browder story is that he ended up hanging himself. He goes through, he pleads not guilty. He doesn't take the plea deal.
Never takes a plea deal.
We learn of his story. We learn of his innocence. We learn of the injustice, the travesty surrounding the entire situation. But he was kept for 2 years in solitary confinement. And the emotional scarring and damage was so great that he, even having, quote unquote, won the battle with the legal system, it's too much for him. And I think that speaks, just so much to not only how unfair some of these laws can be, but in general to the condition of these prisons. And they mention it at one point in the documentary. I believe it's when they're talking about Khalif. It's when they say a system that many believe is designed to break you within 30 days. Like, it's specifically meant to break you down so that you don't cause trouble because you're seen as a troublemaker. Even somebody's case who, like Khalif, who hasn't even been to trial. So we hold up these ideals like innocent until proven guilty, but we treat, was that this documentary they said we treat the rich and guilty better than the poor and innocent. That was impactful quote. I don't want to say it's great because it made me feel awful, but it was very impactful.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going ahead and say this here. One of the things that we're working on in Kansas City is the reduction of tickets being written for non-moving violations, primarily with people who have expired tags or who haven't registered their car yet because they can't afford to. So there's been a decrease here through Mayor Quentin Lucas's office. Thank God that's one of the things he actually does right, even though I'm not a big fan of him. Being able to reduce the amount of tickets being written on the streets for people who have expired tags. That is such a big deal because a lot of the reasons people have expired tags is because they simply cannot pay the taxes that their car is bringing in, and they can't pay the sales tax that they're, when they buy the car. They have enough to buy the car, not enough to provide the sales tax to get it licensed and registered. So reducing that keeps, people from having to spend excess money of $75, $80 here, and then still every single other day get another ticket and another ticket and another ticket, as they're pretty much leeching off of a non-moving violation. It doesn't get you points on your license, but you're still going to have to go into court and pay the $75, $80 fee. So reducing that is ways that we can prevent, thinking about it, people who are in poverty are going to be the ones that experience that the most, right? And we know that people who are of color are increasingly more likely to also be impoverished. And if these are the people that we're going after every day who don't have tags and their car isn't registered, but we're arresting them or we're pulling them over, you're increasingly more likely to put a person of color at risk of police brutality just by simply having them be pulled over every time for having an expired.
Exactly. No, I think it's something that we need to do better, specifically on this issue in our education system. When I went to buy my first car, I had no idea that there were taxes, sales taxes involved in getting your car registered, all of that stuff. I had no idea. So I went in, and not only was I taken advantage of by an ultra salesman, as a 21-year-old kid, my parents didn't go with me to buy my car.
Right.
And then, I got paid that day $500 for the week for groceries and everything. And he took $300 of it for a down payment. And now he's like, oh, now you have to put $100 down for insurance. Oh, and by the way, you got to go get a license too. And I'm like, dude, you just took all my money.
Yep.
So we need to teach, we need to include that in the things that we're teaching about, especially, to African-American students.
No, it's so important. And that's also a responsibility, I think, within those advertising groups. Because, oh my gosh, when I was a kid and I saw all of those 0% interest for 36 months, I was like, a car costs $300. Cool.
Right.
That's it.
I still get excited when I see those commercials.
Yeah, no. And then just for further discussion later, I ran across a TV show recently. I think it's called Parking Wars. And it's just like the parking authority of Philadelphia and all of their drama and all the people coming in with all their different fees. And I have registration, but I don't have insurance. So that's something to look into later.
Well, speaking of small little laws that need to be less enforced, let's move on to the war on drugs. How much did you know about the war on drugs and war on crime before watching the film? Were you surprised to learn about the racial underpinnings of the legislative policies and the active role in the state in criminalizing and targeting communities of color? It has here the quote from John Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon's aide. I won't read it, but it was the one where essentially he admitted culpability in lying to the general populace about criminalizing, or so first associating marijuana with the hippies and heroin with the blacks, in his words, and then heavily criminalizing both of those things because they couldn't criminalize being black or being against the war. So your thoughts?
Trash ass politicians. Yeah, this wasn't surprising.
I think it was surprising in the fact that somebody actually copped to it. And that's it.
Oh, well, that should be surprising. I mean, yeah. I mean, eventually some politicians eventually grow a heart. I don't know where it comes from, but they grow one. And then they sort of start telling all on themselves. They be like, I don't know if they think they're about to die. So they go, let me get all this off my chest. But maybe that's what he was feeling. He was feeling a close to Jesus moment. And it was like, let me go on ahead and tell some truth.
Right.
But I mean, no, I think growing up in the urban community in the 90s, crack was heavily penalized. And I mean, it was bad to be, people would make fun of crackheads. That was the thing I remember the most about growing up in the 90s was like crack was whack and you don't want to be a crackhead because you go to jail for life. And that's what I remember the most about growing up. And it's even watching a crack documentary, the songs that were being used to like influence urban kids, like your mom does crack rock, and then there's this little girl that's like, no, she doesn't, and it's just like it's a part of culture. It's like the idea of penalizing crack cocaine and being a crackhead was so shameful, and it was something that you didn't want associated with your family, that it became cultural. So I've always known that there was something really bad about crack, and it was in every urban movie. I mean, it was everywhere. So I knew that there was something more wrong about crack than any other drug.
Something that I try to do when we look at things like this and institutional racism, I try to think about somebody who is the opposition, I guess isn't the word I'm looking for, but it's close. Somebody who looks at these things as false or doesn't fully believe, institutional racism exists. And this quote specifically, like if you look at all these things and we say, it went from slavery to sharecropping to Jim Crow, all these things, and it's just a continuation of the same thing. And if you can look at that and say, oh no, that's not what we're doing, and then you listen to John Ehrlichman and say, oh no, we knew exactly what we were doing, we did this, that, and the other. How do you continue then to deny institutional racism when you have a prominent figure within the institution admitting it's racist? This isn't, we in the last 4 years, we have debated facts, we've debated science, things that are rooted in absolute truth and logic. And here we have somebody from the same side of the political spectrum saying, oh no, it's exactly what they're saying it is. Shut the book.
It's called cognitive dissonance. Once people have it, they have to keep going with it. It's like the polarization. It's like one of the reasons I told you I had to start watching Rachel Maddow, because as much as I loved her, she was just affirming everything I already believed, everything that was ingrained in me and my thoughts. Even though I'm a lover of MSNBC, it was something I would come home and watch. It was an affirmation of who I already was. It was no challenge there. So you can develop cognitive dissonance, is what they call it in psychology, by continuing to only feed on the things that affirm you. And so as much as that statement exists, he said it is true, it's real, science is this, you can always go to YouTube and find some conspiracy that's going to affirm your crazy ass theory, and then you can go with that because you already have so much faith in it. And that's what people in white supremacy do. Like people who affirm white supremacy and the need to have these negative thoughts about people of color to justify the system. It's just polarization. It's going back to what you already believe, what you already know, what's already been affirmed, what's already been reinforced. And if you have a family that thinks like that, if you have a community that thinks like that, if you have an institution that you value and that you're a part of that thinks like that, you will become more reinforced to believe that too. This doesn't, like, we don't learn these things in a bubble, in a vacuum. We learn them as a part of an entire collective of things that work on our development and our cognitive thinking, like our way of looking at the world. It's by design. It's not happenstance. So when you say, how can you continue to believe this? How can you not? How can you not continue to believe in racism? How can you not continue to believe that Black people are thugs? How can you not? It's easy. Even with, this is one little bit of information. Of course, there's a lot more of it, but you have to search it out.
There was another really great quote in this. I think it was from another Nixon aide about the Southern strategy, where he literally says, of course, he starts off by saying, this is off the record, right? It's not, you're being taped. And he goes, you started out saying inward, inward, inward. you can't say that anymore. They get mad, and then we started saying, Jim Crow, these things. We can't say that anymore. Now we're saying things like, tax cuts and, things like this. So it's the same thing. We know that blacks are disproportionately affected more than whites. You pair like all of these things, all of these statistics, all of these true things, and I just don't understand. I understand that it's hard. When you've been generations of echo chambers of the evils of the Negro man, but at some point, the onus is on you as an individual to figure out that it's wrong. You can't sit back and say forever, oh, well, I was raised that way, so it's okay that I say the N-word all the time and I think of black people as lesser. That's just how it was back in the day.
I think Jane Elliott would disagree.
But you can just blame that on your ancestry?
If we can blame an institution for the reason and why things are what they are, we can also blame institutions for why people are ignorant. Like the institution just didn't stop with criminalization. It also is that we all were raised and put into a school system that only teaches white supremacy.
Right.
I absolutely agree. I have some very close family members that have some very differing feelings about these types of subjects than I do. And it's taken me a lot of realizing that, oh, well, this is where you grew up. This is when you grew up. And this is your current exposure to diversity now. So I don't accept it, but it makes a little bit more sense. I did also kind of want to respond to the original question about how we responded to, the drug war and all of that. I think it's really important to recognize this cycle. It's ever prevalent, guys, and it's always feeding off of each other. So, step one, doctors do not take Black women's pain seriously. There are so many studies out there that Black women do not receive proper medical care because their pain is not considered serious, or their symptoms that they're seen as, hysterical and just overreacting. So, okay, you can't get the doctor to see you. How are you going to deal with your pain? If it's, significant pain, you're going to find what's available. And whether that's on the street, whether that's someone in your own house, you're going to take advantage of that. Then they get addicted to it. Guess what? Can they afford therapy and significant behavioral services? No. And so then they get trapped into this, I'm in pain. I cannot get the adequate medical attention I need. I found what works for me, what's available on the street. And now that I have this, I'm getting busted because of some other situation. And now I'm in jail for cash bail. It literally evolves into each other. And that's the one small aspect of it. That's just one example that I'm aware of.
But even in that same sense, because I have come to believe as a Black woman these negative things about myself, that I will internalize my pain and hold it in and not expect adequate treatment when I go to the hospital. And I will even convince myself that my pain is not real. And that is how white supremacy works. You don't have to be white to engage in white supremacy. You can internalize it as a person of color and throw it on yourself. Right now, we are having a bunch of people argue over whether Ma'Khia Bryant deserved to get killed because of internalized racism of white.
Yeah, about that little girl, and that we have so many comparative situations right now where there are drastically different results.
And I think it's interesting too what Shamika says about kind of internalizing that pain, because that's something that I can definitely identify with, even as a white man. And I know in the terms of of demographic, power structures, white men are at the top. Even we are sometimes victims of white supremacy and in power structures, because we can't go to the doctor. We can't go to a therapist. We can't talk about our feelings. That's not something that's seen as acceptable. And it's definitely changed in the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years. but that's still how, even, I'm only going to be 27. That's still how I was raised. People my age, so it's still something that we're dealing with.
No, it's very.
The truth is that. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, recognizing racial disparities in work opportunities and types of positions that, or even that diversity hire, like hiring somebody just because they fit a mold, not because of their skills. There's so much to us, but thank you guys for having me. I'm gonna pop in and out a little bit. Micah is here now also.
I'll tell him I said hi. Hey, bud. So I don't know if you were paying attention to some of the topics we were talking about. Yeah, I think it's a great time to move on to the next question. How did you think media and popular culture representations of Black Americans, particularly of Black men, have contributed to a dangerous climate of white fear and anxiety? How can we challenge these instances of racism and dehumanization?
I think it's absolved white men of the tortures and the heinous crimes that they've committed against humanity.
Well, you're always seeing white people as the hero in almost every movie. Like, I just finished watching Falcon and Winter Soldier, and the biggest part of that is the Falcon coming to terms earlier with, like, America's not ready for a Black Captain America, and trying to come to terms with, like, maybe they are eventually, but, like, at the beginning he himself can't even see a Black person in that role as a hero himself. And so, like, yeah, pop culture has always created the stigma of, like, the white hero, and then a lot of times you see Black people as the criminal in a lot of aspects,
or at best like a sidekick.
Yeah.
The sidekick.
I think Shamika, honestly, guys, if you are watching this and you haven't seen our video on institutional racism, please go check it out. Shamika has like 7 degrees in relevant studies, and she gave an amazing presentation on the subject. One of the things that she talked about in it was the portrayal of Black men as criminals in a lot of pop culture and a lot of movies and TV shows. And it's something that you see over and over again, you internalize it, and you start to associate, well, if I'm seeing a Black man in handcuffs, even though it's a TV show, he must be a criminal. And so the next time I see a Black man, I'm going to make all of these connections because of what I've seen in movies and TV shows. And this Black man I'm looking at right now, even if he's not in any way associated with law enforcement, I'm assuming he's a criminal. And it's subconscious pathways that all of this exposure leads you to, that's the danger of subconscious things like that. You don't even know it's happening.
I wanted to say, and I wanted to go back to this, like putting Black men as a center of criminality and all these heinous crimes and things against humanity, specifically as it concerns the white community, really absolves white men of the heinous crimes that they have done against the Black community. And I love how Birth of a Nation talks about this. Like, the greatest thing that they were able to create was this narrative around Black men being rapists and scaring white women and trying to force them into unions with them. And that became one of the greatest fears that allowed Jim Crow to flourish, which is one of the things to say, yeah, we need to separate Black men from our precious Black women and girls. We don't want that to become a problem. But really, when we look at this, there's always been a history in our culture of white men doing that to Black women. And that narrative never, ever gets pushed. And we never talk about that. We never talk about rape in the Black community from white men, in which there used to be, laws that allowed white men to walk into a Black family's house and he could just have his way with Black women. and there was nothing that the law could do. You couldn't punish this person. It was not a crime, and we never built a narrative around that, even though that was the actuality and reality of the situation that was occurring during this time. And so I think that what it does when we have media that creates a narrative that is unrealistic and isn't truthful at all, we absolve the real criminals from their real acts and allow them to flourish. And so, like right now, we're doing the same thing with white supremacy. We see more terrorist acts from white people in these, white supremacist groups, in these hate groups, than we have of, Muslim communities. But that's not the narrative that's being pushed. The narrative is that Islam is terror and black people are terror and the criminality there is mass. But we see a lot of these church bombings and these business, tirades that people are going in and it's smashing up, whole businesses in the Asian community. That's been done by white people. So yet the narrative still isn't the real focus, is not on the real person or real perpetrators, it's on minorities, when that is not and has never been the case in the US.
One of the fascinating things about history, and I think it's something that Micah I don't think he touched on it, but something he said reminded me that history is always written by the victor. And so for 100 years, black people weren't even considered full people in this country. And so, of course, all of this history is going to be written by white people, especially, white men, especially. And so because of that, you don't have the narrative that white men are raping black women. You don't have all of these things. Being a part of our time now and being able to see all of the nuances of society, the main narrative that is being pushed since 9/11, really since, Desert Storm, has been, a bias against the Middle East, the terrorists, against Muslims specifically. But now we are starting to try to shift that narrative to white supremacist terror, homegrown terrorists. Like you said, all of these mass shootings and bombings have been white people. The majority of serial killers are white people. I think that, it might not be the main narrative, but there is definitely support of something along the lines of that narrative that is much closer to the truth.
And you always know after something happens, whether it be with a white person or a black person, you can guarantee that there will be somebody out there who changes their basic feeling of the situation based on who it is. Like, oh, as a white person, well, what was the other person to them doing? If it was a black person, what was the black person doing? It's not a personal responsibility for the white person, usually. It's personal responsibility to the umpteenth degree. Like, have they ever smoked marijuana in their life? Well, then they deserve this kind of thing.
Of course he got shot by the police. He had 3 parking tickets.
Yeah.
You can't let an animal like that on the streets.
That kind of mentality, you see it all the time, especially right now, where you see so many police killings. And it's like, well, what was he doing? Did he have anything in his system? Whereas you see, like, fucking Rittenhouse shoots up Wisconsin, and it's like, he was exercising his rights. And it's like, where is that line? You know exactly where that line is.
It needs to have nothing to do with race. But we're still a long ways away from that.
Yeah.
We got one more question here, and we're getting close to an hour, so let's introduce this and then get some final thoughts. Many politicians, including the Clintons, Newt Gingrich, and Charles Rangel in this film, have apologized for their role in promoting devastating, tough-on-crime legislation. Considering the billions of dollars made off the imprisonment of people, the ongoing practice of prison labor, and the cases of unjust imprisonment, as in the tragic case of Khalif Browder, is an apology enough?
Hell no.
Is our country compelled to repay the communities and families in a more material, restorative way? Why or why not? Shamika, your thoughts?
We deserve reparations. And
absolutely. absolutely deserve reparations. Yeah, a lot of people were right to call into question Bill Clinton's apology in 2016 as it was
Especially for the timing of it.
around, Hillary's run. So, Shamika?
The devil is a lie because the Wi-Fi just tried to cut me out when I was saying something important. But we deserve reparations. We're like, yes, you cannot put all these bills in to defund the criminal justice system. You can't even put things in and say we're going to put reform the prison system and not think that you have to give these people that you've hurt, this community that you hurt. You have to give them reparations because you've done something unjust. And we know that when someone has done something unjustly, we usually pay that up with actual economic funds. If you've done something wrong, people can sue you and you can go to, court and you can get your money. Well, we would like to sue the United States government for false imprisonment, for wrongful arrest. We want to sue you for promises unmade and unfounded and followed through. We want our money and we want it in our banks tonight. We want it. Whatever the equivalent of 40 acres is in a mule is, I need that now 6 times over because you didn't give it to my ancestors. You didn't give it to their kids. You didn't give it to their kids. You didn't give it to my mama. And now I want it. I want all of it. I want everything that's owed to me. I want the entire United States to pay Black people every ounce and dime of money that we deserve. I want everything. I want it now. We want it today. We want it tonight. And we don't want to hear no motherfucking fussing about it. Just run us our motherfucking check. That's all we want to hear.
All right. Thanks for joining us, guys. that's all we have to say. That was it. No, I think it's interesting you bring up the fact suing the government, and that's one of the things that as the film progressed, I see almost a necessity to repeal the 13th Amendment because you would need to obviously replace it with something to still uphold no slavery. But you need something to replace it with no slavery, no ifs, ands, or buts. Right now, the prison system is taking advantage of the clause of the 13th Amendment that says that except in the cases of, committing these crimes, can you be held as a slave. And I think they touched on it a lot at the beginning. I don't think they touched on it as much at the end to really tie it all together. But that was one of my biggest takeaways, that this is, I also wish that they would have talked more about, at the time that the amendment was written, if they have anything to say about the intent of the wording of it, because it seems like it was written by people who knew exactly what was going to happen with imprisonment and the way things have gone. I wish they would have touched on that a little bit, but the way things are going, and like we've touched on with some of these Nixon era aides coming out and talking about, we know exactly what's going on. We know that this is a continuation of slavery and Jim Crow. I think we absolutely need to address this unjust clause in this amendment.
Well, all that is true. We need to be addressing all of this. We need to be going through and saying who have we wronged as a community? How can we make it right? And I think that you cannot even have the beginning to.
Hard.
Me personally, for the question, of course, definite paying back of what's owed.
I will not be silenced.
But the beginning of the question about is it enough? No. If you had the power to mess it up, fix it.
Right.
You're the president. You have some sort of pull somewhere that if you really wanted to, you could make a lot more of a dent than just a oopsie, my bad.
Right.
There's a lot more steps that can be taken, especially if there's a number of them who are like, wow, we shouldn't have done that. Do something then. Do something now.
Jamika talked earlier about Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and the roles that they played in the same time period as Clinton was in office, and some of these pieces of legislation that they helped get through and enforce. And if you have people like that who are who have said, hey, we realize that some of these things were probably not the best. Let's go ahead and change some of that. And now they're in office and they haven't done that. I think it speaks to probably what would have been done 4 years ago if Hillary would have won the Electoral College, because as we all know, she won the popular vote. If she would have actually become president, it's all campaign promises. We can't trust a lot of these things that they say, even if they're apologizing, because like you said, that they were in position to do these things in the first place, and they mess it up so bad. You had your chance. Now, like Shamika was saying earlier, the people who have made the mess can't be the ones to fix it, because we've already seen what they are capable of doing and where their interests lie, and they're not as interested in fixing the problem as they are whatever self-interest that they have in the situation. So.
I also think that people who help to break a system should be in charge, at least on the front lines of repairing it. They need to be the ones doing the hardcore work and not the ones in the spotlight. They need to let the people who know what to do the actual work.
Mm-hmm.
This is definitely a time for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden to be setting up task force committees dedicated to breaking down some of these institutions. Their job right now is to be listeners and to put resources and energy behind actual change, but not to frontline that change, because they have shown and proven themselves incapable of doing that. We cannot let our oppressors also be our saviors. That's not how this works. You don't get to oppress me and then come in and save me. That's not fair to to the community that I live in. And it's also not fair to people who do not trust you. And so if you want to build trust, you have to give people the extension of being able to do that. And one way you can do that is to humble yourself and take a back seat and sit the fuck down.
Absolutely. Well,
which is why I love Bernie so much, because Bernie is willing to sit the fuck down and let other people speak.
Yes, willing to sit down and wear some gorgeous
wear the mittens.
It's about time to get wrapped up, guys. I think it's interesting. This last question kind of hinted at reparations. We talked about reparations. Special live shout out right now. We're going to be reading the reparations handbook coming up in May. As part of our breakdown series. It's a brand new book coming out, so we will be able to read it. We're getting exclusive copies. We're going to be able to read it, break it down for you guys. Have a special guest on with us to break it down as well. So keep an eye out for those announcements. Super excited. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Any last words, Shamika or Karen/Micah?
Burn down the system of institutional injustice. That is all.
Burn it down.
What she said. All right, guys. Thank you so much. No, Karen.
I was just going to say a quick word that, these presentations are important. And again, it is a huge project to try to dismantle the system, or however we want to reform or defund or reallocate resources. But we have to realize that this institution is real and long imprinted on society, and it is up to us to move it forward.
Amen, amen, amen.
Duh.
Very well said, Karen.
So you cannot, and I want to follow, that means that you cannot just be a keyboard warrior. You have to use your real voice. You have to be afraid. You can't be afraid of losing friends. You can't be afraid of making people feel bad sometimes. You literally have to do what you know is right, even if it costs you everything.
Yeah, just to follow up on that follow-up, last summer when George Floyd was murdered, thank God we got some justice there. Was that last week or 2 weeks ago? When George Floyd was murdered, you might have seen me become a little more active on social media. One of the things I kept hearing was, why don't you guys shut up and go do something about it? So here we are. We're 3 months strong, going with Suf. Hope you guys will stick around with us. We've got so much more to offer, so much more to discuss, so much more to teach, and so much more to get involved in. Thank you, guys.